Welcome to the Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. I'm Cynthia Allen, and I'm very pleased to be here with you to open the research track. And I will introduce you to our speaker in a moment, but first I just want to mention a few things that might be helpful to you. It's particularly important that you identify the chat area and start interacting over in chat. You can just start out by introducing yourself and where you're from. And as you talk among each other and back and forth, you'll start, I think, a rich conversation about this topic. It will be helpful to us in the panel discussion tomorrow on research. We will be taking a look at the chat from all three talks in this track and grabbing out interesting bits to pull into the panel discussion. So please do participate in chat if you're so inclined. Also, Arlene Klein, our summit manager, organizer, wizard, wonderful person behind the scenes, and often you talk to me about how friendly she is as well, is over there, and you can let her know if you're having some problems, and she can try to help you solve those technical issues as well. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Diane Hannemann. Diane is a PhD biochemist, biophysicist with a passion for how all those wonderful cells in the body at the molecular level keep talking to each other, communicating, and bringing about health. And she started out in marketing, actually over kind of in my neck of the woods in the Midwest at Purdue, but then eventually went on for her PhD in molecular biophysics and biochemistry at Yale University. And she had a chance to do some research there on how motor protein uses chemical energy to transport materials along the tracks inside a cell, which I think I need to take the time to actually read that research. And she is been very committed. She's been part of NIH in the past and is now more recently working with the Institute for Integrative Health in Baltimore, where she is leading an interdisciplinary research initiatives. And then, like a lot of us, she decided she had to feed some other aspects of her mind, body, soul, and decided to sign up for a Feldenkrais training program, and she's currently enrolled in the Baltimore training program. Thank you so much, Diane, for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you, Cynthia. This is a wonderful invitation and opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the conversation here.
Good, good. So you and I met this last year at the conference, and we had an opportunity to talk just a little bit about the importance of expanding the understanding around research, both around research in general, but then also how the Feldenkrais method has been researched and what can be done to research it. So I think you're going to give us a nice little tutorial here today on understanding research, and then maybe some ideas potentially about how people who are interested in furthering research could maybe go a little bit along that way. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Great, good. So I think you've got some slides to share with us.
Yes, I do. So thank you, Cynthia. I think it's a really exciting time for Feldenkrais and health research. So I'm going to just highlight today some things for people to consider when they're reading about research, and just as you said, some thoughts for if, hopefully if you want to design a research study, some things to consider that are particularly unique to studying the Feldenkrais method.
Great, great.
Fabulous. So I'll find my slides here, and I think they're up now. Can you see them?
I can see them.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it.
And I have your picture up in the right-hand corner of the slides, just so you know, we still see you.
Uh-oh. All right. Well, I do have some notes, but that's okay. I'm glad to be participating and seen. So I titled my talk here, really, The Power of Inquiry. And, it really meshes both of my passions here, which is both inquiry as the scientific method and inquiry in the Feldenkrais method. And so when we think about inquiry, the actual definition The formal definition is called the act of asking for information or an investigation. And I think it's so appropriate because isn't that exactly what Moshe Feldenkrais, a physicist, a scientist himself, did initially when he used the process of inquiry through his curiosity to understand what was happening with his knee. My knee hurts. It's not working. The function of it is degrading. And if it doesn't get better, I have to get surgery. So his curiosity and aspect of doing personal inquiry led us to the development of the Feldenkrais method. So it's inherent to the process, and it's given us the great gift of the method that we're talking about at this summit. And similar to the Feldenkrais method, understanding research and learning how to read and critically evaluate research, it's a lifelong process. And I love this word cloud that I found online, and it says, inquiry, you're a lifelong learner. And it's absolutely true. So I want people to keep that in mind while I'm going to give some standpoints here, some points here. It's a process that's personal, and it's a process that unfolds over time. So, the best way to learn how to read research is to do it, is to read the research. So why do we want to think about research? If, with the Feldenkrais method, if we've practiced it or we're practitioners, we're pretty darn convinced that it works and we love it. So if we know it works, why do we need to do research on it? Well, again, it's great to be able to understand what it is we are doing and to be able to apply the process of inquiry to Feldenkrais to maybe reveal some information about how it actually works its magic in our nervous system. And when we reveal some of that information through research, we can then leverage that knowledge in engaging clinicians, folks that are coming to see us, so clients, the public at large, other providers or policymakers, with the thought that ultimately we can promote a wider adoption of Feldenkrais. So from that perspective, beyond curiosity, conducting research is, I think, a really vital consideration for the growth in the future of the Feldenkrais method. And so, of course, like anything, there's not just one type of research. And I've danced in all of these worlds, and that's definitely due to my inherent curiosity about biology. And, basic research is the far end of really that molecular level. Basic research is asking the questions about how does the world work, and not necessarily having an intention that there's an application to that knowledge. And interestingly enough, the NIH, the majority of the research that the United States National Institutes of Health funds is basic research. And Congress often says, well, why are you doing that? Isn't the really juicy stuff in the applied science? Well, no, because basic research is a treasure because we don't know how that's going to lead to a new discovery. So basic research has led us to understand neuroplasticity. We learned, about a decade ago, that the brain and our nervous system doesn't stop after we develop as children, but continues to grow. And how wonderful of a discovery that has been for understanding how the Feldenkrais method is working. The other aspect is clinical studies. Well, why are clinical studies important? Well, this gives us an opportunity to actually ask a question. Can we potentially test a question and learn if we can, I don't want to say manipulate, but encourage change within a system, a physical system. And clinical studies allow us to ask those questions and observe what could happen when we perturb a system. And the behavioral and social sciences, well, this is all how we think and interact with others. And you may say, well, what does that have to do with Feldenkrais? Well, the psychology and sense of ourself and sense of our well-being in relation to others in society is, from my perspective, a wonderful aspect, an important aspect of the Feldenkrais method. So I love this picture because this really kind of sums up the scientific community's solution to developing a process for evaluating research. And it goes by the wonderful name of peer review, which sounds very friendly. But as this picture shows, going through the process can feel really brutal and hostile. And but it wasn't initially intended to be. I want to remind everyone, including any fellow scientists and researchers that are listening today, that the research and scientific enterprise was developed based on discourse. We need to have discourse. It's really important. When we go back to the Socratic method, what did they do? Well, it was using discourse and debate to figure out, well, what's consensus of truth? And that truth is always evolving. Well, what the scientific community has come up with is peer review. And so it's rigorous review, and if something is published in a peer-reviewed journal, it means that this scientist with this paper made it to the other side with all these sticks and satchels. There's even, my gosh, death there at the end of the line, and he made it through it and published his paper. So you can trust that there's been some scientific rigor applied to it, but you need to, again, it's that Feldenkrais way. What does my internal sense tell me about what I'm experiencing, what I'm reading? So what I'm going to encourage everyone here is, while I'm going to give you some ways to really, cut up and evaluate what you're reading, it's bringing the healthy skeptic and recognizing that it's, think about yourself as, around a dining table and you want to learn more about a topic. Asking questions doesn't always equal hostility, and in fact, it's encouraged and needed in science. So this is an interesting diagram that I found online, and it kind of outlines the different types of evidence. But I think it also gets to what we were just talking about, is how does an idea evolve into an evidence-based action? And so this, it really kind of maps out how the scientific process and research attempts to do that. So someone has an idea, opinions, we publish that. There may be no data on it, but it's to incite curiosity from the field. And others may weigh in and say, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that in my practice. We don't have any research on it, but I'm observing it and I've published a case study. Others will say, all right, I think we're onto something and we've got a hypothesis and I'm going to test it. So I'm going to do a primary research study. And then once this primary research study builds up and there's a body of knowledge around a particular question, and again, in scientific research, you can have a lot of different people working on the exact same question, but in different ways, and that only enhances the knowledge. Then it kicks into this whole process of other scientists that do reviews of this primary research. And they look at it, they may just publish a paper that tells you, well, here's what the state of the science is out there. But systematic reviews and meta-analysis apply statistical analysis to tell you, all right, well, this is the best of what's out here. And then at the very top of that little red pyramid that you can't read is something that says clinical practice guidelines. And this is when there's a huge body of knowledge and somebody that's an authority, usually a clinical association, publishes clinical practice guidelines. And these are to be used by the public and clinicians in deciding what they think the best thing I should do. If I have a headache, should I take an aspirin? Well, this is what the evidence tells you. It doesn't mean, again, it's kind of a consensus truth, but it's always evolving. So when you look at this, while it's a pyramid, it's not we get to the truth and then that sticks. I see this as an iterative process, because you're always going to have disagreement. You're going to have new information, new ideas. And so the process is continually working itself through. But I think it's a nice way to kind of map out what kind of paper and research information is out there and available for all of us. So here's the basics. Just as our body has a skeleton, the research papers have a skeleton and kind of have these key parts that you're always going to find. And the abstract is what I call kind of the read all about it. You could read the abstract, and if it's written well in less than 300 words, you're going to learn all the major aspects of the paper. What was a research question? How did they study it? And what did they find? You may read that and say, I need to know no more, and move on. But if it intrigues you, then you'll continue through the paper. And the next piece is the introduction. I want to encourage everyone. A lot of people will skip over to that and just get to the data or go to the conclusions. The introduction is a really juicy, nice piece where it lays out the background on the issue, some of the controversies that may be beyond the issue, and really lay out the study rationale. Why does it matter? Why, as a reader, should I care? Why did somebody invest money and time in doing this study? The methods section. This is down and dirty. How did they design their study? How did they recruit participants? Who are their participants? And how did they plan to collect the data? Important to consider. And you may look at it and decide, well, I don't like the study design, and go no further on the paper. But if you do, there's a whole section on data analysis. And what I want to remind people is that the data analysis section, it's the toughest part to read because it's the driest part, and that's intentional. Because it's the data analysis, and the data analysis section has no interpretation in it. It's crunching the numbers, identifying themes, and it's just the facts, ma'am. No opinions, just the facts. So it's really dry, and you want to push through it. And boy, if it's quantitative research, it has a lot of numbers and stats. But it's worth the time if you're going to quote the study or you want to replicate the study. You need to spend some time there. The research and discussion. Well, now we're starting to get interesting because now we start to get into interpretations. What are the findings that the author thinks that they found based on the analysis of the data? And then the conclusion is what I call the real human aspect of the paper, which is what the author says, all right, well, what did we learn? What did we get out of this? And maybe we didn't get what we wanted, but this is what we learned, and I'm going to share it with others and maybe make some suggestions for future work. And then the references. As a geek, I love the references because it's more papers for me to read. But it's a collection of cited and related publications, and it really is a treasure trove in time. You're able to see history on the work and, again, do additional reading if you're just interested or you want to do a study. It's important for you to have that resource.
Can we stay there for a second, Diane?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm not, I find I get lost in the section on methods and data analysis because I don't really have that background. But when I have been hanging out with people like yourself who do have that background, I have been shocked at how quickly a researcher can tell me what's wrong with the study design or the way it was analyzed and why it may not be something to put too much weight in at this juncture. I would assume you've seen something like that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really important point because there is no perfect research study. And at the same time, Mother Nature doesn't give up her secrets easily. So when you begin to get in and study a system, the data that you receive may not be what you expected. But the actual study design, I'm going to talk, go into more depth later about some of the things that we need to consider, particularly for body work research and Feldenkrais and some of the criticisms that have been on that study. It's healthy to look at that, but it's also worth evaluating what is the value in this study. It may not be the ultimate evidence that is needed, but what can we borrow from it? What can we learn from it? Because even something as simple as a case study, which could be a single report on a single individual that had a remarkable result, there's something there that can be built upon. Mm-hmm. So again, it's having that healthy skeptic, but it's also recognizing the value, finding the nugget in what is presented, and then thinking about, well, what can be done next? And what I hope to present is to give some food for thought that, we always can do more. We always can do more, and to not get hung up on that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that has really struck me, I haven't been reading a lot of research recently, but I went through a huge phase of it around osteoporosis and bone health when I was really trying to understand the issues that I thought were pertinent to the Bones for Life work.
Mm.
And I saw some conclusions once in a while that didn't seem to fit what people had discovered, which
Yes.
I found also interesting. So, I mean, even whether or not that was true and my understanding of it was correct or not, I think there is a lot of interesting things that can perk in your own thinking, to start trying to wade through some of those studies that seem well matched, at least to where you're at in your own discovery process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna dig into all those aspects and several of these sections in detail. But you're spot on. And I think one thing I want to add to your previous question about faulty or flawed study designs is that the beauty is, as we are moving towards more in the health sciences in particular, looking at system science and ways that we can study the body less as a reductionist, materialistic, break apart the parts to understand the whole, is to really, how can we better understand the whole and understand the body as an integrated system? And the scientific community is responding to that need and that new shift in paradigm thinking, getting back to the real way of thinking, our real reality, is new methodologies and new ways of designing studies are evolving and occurring to help us meet these needs for these new types of research questions. And the Feldenkrais method, is something that needs new types of research designs. So just a note on, so who are these authors and the journals that are publishing these papers? And, it's going to tell you right at the top of the paper who the authors are, who their affiliations are, and frequently their credentials, whether they're a medical doctor, a physical therapist, etc. And this is good to consider beyond just what's maybe visible there, and just take another step and say, okay, well, that's their credibility for why they have academically maybe, or they were involved in this study. But understanding what their expertise is and their knowledge is going to give you insight into what lens they are using in developing the research question, the way they've designed the study design, and then very much to what you were getting to, Cynthia, which is what conclusions do they draw? Because depending on what lens they're bringing to the study, no matter how objective they try to be, and no matter how objective the reviewers are, if they come from a similar range of expertise, then their lens is going to be the same, and they may interpret their conclusions are going to be based on their own internal bias, really. So it's just something to keep in mind when you look at it. I love studies, particularly for something in Feldenkrais, when you see it's a multidisciplinary group. You might have a rehab doctor, a PT person, and a Feldenkrais practitioner. Outstanding, because now you really have cross-pollination for that study. But you need to apply the same question to who published the paper too, because the individual journals, they're not all the same, and they all have different target audiences, subject matters that they're focusing on, and they may be represented like JAMA is the publication of the American Medical Association, which for years, they tried, and this is not slander, this was actually a court case determined that they tried to eliminate the chiropractic profession about 50 years ago. That wasn't very nice, but they've come a long way. And today you'll find studies where they're recommending ginger, an herbal, which can be considered an herbal supplement for pregnant women experiencing nausea. So again, science is evolving. If you see a body work study reported in JAMA, you might go, wow, but this is the medical profession. What do they know about this work? What biases are they bringing? But at the same time, you can say, well, that's a score for us, because if it's published there, then we must really have done a study that was strong to convince even some of our biggest skeptics. So just a note on that, and I'm not picking on JAMA, but I think it's an interesting example because over the years I've watched their editorial board and their table of contents really evolve for me in a positive way. And then there are other journals that cater to their communities, including our wonderful Feldenkrais journal, which is published by the International Feldenkrais Federation. So types of data. Now I got to get a little bit dry, less pictures, but I had to do it. So there's different types of data out there, and I really think about this as it's the way people think differently about information. And so there's numbers and narrative, and this is very akin to the left side and the right side of the brain. So quantitative data, numbers-driven data, is very left side. It's left side of the brain, concerned with discovering the facts about a natural or social phenomenon. It assumes a fixed and measurable reality. The data that is collected are things that can be measured. The data that is analyzed, we use numerical statistical analysis. And the results that are reported are very much framed within a statistical analysis. Again, for a world that is pretty predictable. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is like our right brain. It's much more subjective, but it's open to really having an appreciation of human behavior, and that this human behavior operates in a dynamic and negotiated reality. The data that it collects reflects this and is often done through participant observations, interviews, surveys. The data they retrieve are themes that come out from these interviews and what people have said about their experience. And the data is reported in the language of the participants or those that actually provided the data. So there are two different ways of looking at the same situation. And for certain questions, you're going to develop a study that's going to be stronger on one side than the other. So just like our brain has left and right sides, we generally work at that integration point, some sides more than the other, but we try to integrate. And research is really the same. So everybody thinks about the randomized control trial, and I think it's what we think of when we think of people doing research in white lab coats. And it's really the quintessential of the quantitative research world. And it was developed with very good intentions, and again, really driven out of the biomedical model that has been in place for so long of a reductionist, the body is the sum of its parts. And so the randomized control trial was developed to essentially minimize variability and nonspecific effects. So the quintessential example is studying a drug. Is it going to be effective in a particular treatment? So the design of a RCT, as they call them, randomized control trial, is asking a question of, will the intervention work under ideal circumstances in a controlled environment with a very highly selected homogeneous population, providers that are highly trained, have similar training, similar levels of experience, using a standardized protocol, one size fits all, everyone gets the same treatment despite their needs. And what this does is it's aiming to minimize all the background non-specific information so that any changes that are seen in the study can be attributed to the intervention. It's fantastic for testing drugs. Not so good when we're trying to look at a system like Feldenkrais or bodywork. And so, Cynthia, this is where this thick slide here really gets to the aspects you were talking about, which is I pulled it together looking at items that are common in the criticism of Feldenkrais research or other sister practices such as yoga, massage therapy, etc. They all suffer from some of the same, I say suffer, but they, are up against some of the same challenges when trying to do a research study to prove efficacy. And so one of these areas, and if they're not addressed, if these issues are not addressed, or at least tried to be addressed, you're going to introduce bias into your study, and your results are going to be less dependable, and the skeptics, will muscle up their arms and get their sticks out and be able to come after you. And so, but what you really want to do is think about these things when you do read a research study, or think about them when you're designing a study. So blinding means, that you're going to have a group that you're giving the intervention to. You're going to be treating that, maybe giving them a functional integration lesson in Feldenkrais, and a group that you're not, the control group. And what you want in blinding is that the participant doesn't know if they're in the control group or if they're getting the intervention. And even better is if the therapist doesn't know if they're providing a placebo or giving the intervention. Well, I think we can pretty quickly see that's really hard.
I personally can't figure out how to do that in the Feldenkrais work.
Right, exactly. So let's just assume we can't do that. So what are our options? Or if you're reading a paper, what could they have done? Well, they can potentially blind, to make the effort of blinding the evaluation staff. So the people that are evaluating the data, you don't tell them what data belongs to what group. That helps some. If you did try to blind it, and I talk about that a little bit next on creating some control groups, is you can survey the participants and ask them if they thought they were in the study intervention or not. And this works, and then you can use that information as control variable in the analysis. And this works nicely when your control is something like an active control, where you're maybe comparing Feldenkrais method with yoga therapy, or Feldenkrais method with standard medical care. And so you can more easily blind. They may not know what the test is, what the research question actually is. And so asking them if they had a good sense of whether that they were in the intervention or not, gives you a sense in that evaluation of your data, and if there was any implicit bias. So the other thing that you can kind of do in the control group is if you can try to, again, minimize what are the other non-specific effects. So if you're going to do a study and you're working with a control group, or even if maybe you're comparing Feldenkrais and physical therapy, for comparison for a particular outcome, do it in the same studio. Use the same location, same setting, same interviewer that met with the participants. The more that you can do to normalize that background, or if you're reading the paper and you see that they've made an effort to do that, again, it just helps to say that any differences you're seeing have to do with what the modality was that was being tested. And I think the other piece of it I just want to touch upon is, and it's all three of these things, they're here in a chart in three separate categories, but I think you can easily see here they all overlap. But it's what a participant or a client or patient expects or believes, if something can help them or won't help them. We know through placebo research that actually impacts the results. So what you want to look at when you're looking at a study, or if you're doing a study, is be careful about your recruitment strategies. Because if you're doing a Feldenkrais study, or you're reading about one, and they've recruited from a group of people that have been doing Feldenkrais for a year, well, these folks, they're going to be advocates. They're going to know it, they're going to love it, and they're going to say, this really helped me. And it may have, but it biases your results. In contrast, you can also say that if they were strictly recruited as a pain group from conventional medicine, they may be really skeptical. Well, how can this gentle, quiet, slow method help me at all? I don't believe it's helping me. And that's going to bias the results as well. So there's some nice published research out there. I listed them, the information here on this slide. It's just a couple of resources where they really give some suggestions on recruitment strategies and other ways to really address a lot of these issues. And again, it's being creative when you're designing the study, and then it's also, when I say creative, it's being inventive, and it's thinking about new ways that you can address the challenge and not just disregard it. And then if you're publishing the study, stating what you've done, or if you couldn't do it, also gives some credibility, as counterintuitive as that sounds.
Yeah, is expectancy been shown to be a problem also in qualitative studies, or is it just in quantitative studies, or is it just qualitative studies that it tends to be a bias that really shows?
Oh, it shows everywhere. It's a very real effect. I mean, the placebo effect is generally, I think they can say about 30%, you know, well, I shouldn't quote anything without having the number in front of me, but it's a significant aspect of all studies. And so that's why just really, when you're looking at a study or designing it, it's really thinking about, well, what are the criteria we're going to use to recruit participants, and trying to, again, find a heterogeneous population, you know, that isn't sourced just from one area or another, because then you're going to get a better example of the population and minimize bias. That's also why larger studies, you know, are helpful as well, because again, you know, if someone is really a believer or disbeliever with numbers, you know, that balances out. So and you know, kind of adding to that, when they say, when critics of non-conventional therapies will say, or something that's outside of the medical, you know, conventional norm, and they say, well, it's just placebo effect. You know, like homeopathy is just placebo effect. Well, you know, placebo effect is real. So
I think we could all use a little more placebo in our lives. So
yeah, exactly. And there's top-notch researchers that are leading the field in placebo research at Harvard. One of our scholars at the institute where I work, a rheumatologist. So it's very real. It's not, and a very interesting field to study in itself. So here's the good news. So I feel like we just got through that whole aspect of being beat by the clubs, and we got to the other side. And here's the really good news, is that we have choices. Choices. See, everything. Feldenkrais method just applies to everything. So the clinical trials, the kind of, while it's nice for a controlled aspect that you're going to study, we've evolved other methods to look at more whole system, more complex, body-centered types of studies. And one of these that was developed by the research community is called the effectiveness or pragmatic studies, which in design are very similar in procedure to randomized controlled trials. But the difference is that rather than being a highly controlled environment, they're designed to be closer to real world practice. So that gets back to what we were talking about, having a heterogeneous population, having an intervention that can be applied with some flexibility so we can be individualized to what the individual needs.
yeah, I actually didn't know that this was happening, so I feel like I'm way behind. That's
yeah. Some people they call them comparative effectiveness research. And that was something, there's a whole group in the government, PCORI, which was created to basically do more studies that are pragmatic studies. Rather, it was really a counter to the RCT world, and it was created by the scientific community. And they're effective. Of course, no research is perfect. No research method is perfect. So with the variability of adding, real world aspects, you're going to bring in more background and heterogeneity in your results. But the results that you have, they retain context. Because what the clinical trial, the randomized control trials do is they strip away all the context. I like to, they're akin to, as a biochemist, what I was trained to do was take a little protein that was incorporated into a body and tissue and strip it out of its environment and isolate it and get it in a clear liquid and then bombard it with something I wanted to test. And I make that akin to like holding the flashlight to the naked molecule and say, tell me all your secrets. You've taken away all of its context. The effectiveness pragmatic studies bring that context back in, and particularly for something like the Feldenkrais method allows for, how we do the method and how the method works to really be incorporated in the study. And the other aspect is goes under the glamorous name of mixed methods research. Well, mixed methods research, as dull as it sounds, is one of my favorites because, again, it's merging the left side and the right side of the brain. You get to do both qualitative study and quantitative study. So if you're looking at a particular question, you're able to examine it from a qualitative, maybe physiological, measurement aspect, but then also complement that with a quantitative data gathering, which could be interviews about asking the patients about what their experiences were, what, their sense of, change in quality of life. And so the more subjective factors, and what's really interesting is in those mixed method research projects that really have strong outcomes, is you'll see complements between the qualitative, maybe physiological data and the softer experiential reported data. And so it's a really powerful method and being used increasingly in biomedical research. And then I just wanted to do a nod to case studies and pilot studies. We've already mentioned them, particularly the case studies. They tend to be single person with extraordinary results, but they allow some flexibility to report on whole person outcomes. The field of naturopathy they started off with this because they apply a lot of different modalities to an individual person because they're trying to bring back systematic balance biochemically, physically, mentally to an individual. So they don't just have even just one outcome that they're looking for. So they're nice ways to be able to convey to others in the community what you're seeing and inspire other studies. Same thing with pilot studies. They're proof of concept. And if they're done well and they get a good result, they can inspire funding or others to do larger studies. So, consider them and be aware of them when you read them. Okay, so this slide, I'm not going to spend that much time on, but I wanted to really give due diligence to the importance of research reviews. I mentioned them earlier there on the pyramid. So as you start to get a body of primary research developed, then you've got to say, okay, well, what do we have out there? And there have been some beautiful studies that have been done for the Feldenkrais method on this, where you're looking at, well, I'm going to start with the literature reviews. There's what I should say is research reviews are not new or original information. Again, they're reports on what work that has been done out there. And a literature review can be a really nice way to bring people up to speed on what's been done out there. You'll often see these written if there's an emerging new field of research or something that's lied dormant for a long time and is suddenly getting attention, and there's a need for or a request for people to be brought up to speed on the history of an issue. Systematic reviews are quite different in that they're really an analytical product. And there's a stepwise process that's applied to not only select what papers have to meet a certain criteria to be considered in the analysis, and then they look at those papers and synthesize the information to provide this really nice kind of one-stop shop of what's the state of the science on the current evidence relevant to a particular research question. So those are really helpful in seeing where things are at, and they've kind of done some of this rigorous review of the research out there for you, so it can save you from reading every paper that's ever been written and having that burden on yourself. And then meta-analysis takes it even another step forward and analyzes data from multiple studies to come up with common treatment effects and what's statistically significant. So again, in that pyramid, really just getting finer and finer with the critiques and ultimately the clinical practice guidelines, which is kind of the, in my dream world, I have, my holy grail wish that Feldenkrais method will be mentioned in clinical practice guidelines for chronic pain. I think we can do it.
I think we can too.
We really can. So I'm gonna put that out there. So now this was getting to very much your question early on, Cynthia.
And Diane, I just want to give you a little time check. We're going to need to start to narrow in fairly quickly here.
Yeah, I know. So study design, I think we've covered a lot of this. I've put this information here, and I've talked with Cynthia about providing maybe a PDF that you should be able to download by the time you're hearing this. That's going to give you some of these details. But everything I've just mentioned, consider it when you're reading the study design. What is it that they did? Is there enough detail to actually replicate this? How big was the sample size? If it was really small, it's going to have less impact, but maybe an important pilot study. But size does matter when it comes to research. So we always want to have the largest sample size as possible. I'm going to just, in the state of time, move on to data analysis. Again, there could be, Cynthia and I were talking right before we started this presentation, that this could really be part of a course where we could really talk about how to look at data analysis. What I want to leave you with on this is, when you're looking at the data analysis section, ask yourself two primary questions. What form of data analysis did they use? So what method did they use to break down their data? And what was it designed essentially to tell you? So what I mean by that is, so a p-value, for example, is a statistical analysis tool that helps to tell the researcher and the reader whether a result was likely chance or if it had, some sort of significance to it, a statistical significance. So essentially, the smaller the p-value, then it's statistically significant. If you start to get to, and the top range is 1, if you get to 0.6 or above, it was just chance. This is like flipping a coin. So it's not a significant result. So other things you're looking at here, mean, coefficient. This list of statistics goes on and on. If you're reading a paper, you come across something you don't know, thank God we have the internet, because you can look it up and you can learn a lot about what's in there. But again, as weedy as this part of the paper is to read, don't disregard it if you're going to quote the paper or if you're trying to design a similar study. You've got to really be, this is where I say, bring out your soft club, one of those foam clubs, and this is where you want to beat it the most and really understand how accurately did they do their data analysis and what tools did they use. And then also, Cynthia, exactly what you're saying. Now, this is the human side, the results and conclusions. The results are what the author thinks are the primary results. Well, you may have just read the data and said, wait a minute, I think you missed something. They may also say, well, gee, we were studying this and we found this. That's still interesting and nice if they discuss. The conclusions are the real human side, as we mentioned, of the paper, the interpretation by the author of what they found. What I want to encourage everyone to think about is, do you agree with the author's assessment? Just as you said, Cynthia, you can say, I looked at the data and you're focusing on one little thing, but you missed, the elephant in the room. And that's valid. A really good scholar will tell you if there's any cautions about the interpretation of results. And sometimes that feels like a letdown. You get to the conclusions. They're like, well, what we found is encouraging, but it's not significant. So we need to do more studies. It's okay. They're saying that, but that's good scholarship. It just means more work needs to be done, but don't throw the paper out with the bathwater. And then I like this bit, personal reflection. When you read, you're going to read a paper for your own reasons, from curiosity to wanting to do a study to wanting to make a good case. I used to work in the federal government where I translated science to inform policy decisions. So, does this paper give me a good punchline to make my argument, in Congress or the dinner table or in your practice? But it may also be a personal inspiration. You can say, I knew we were doing something important and now we have evidence to show it. So it doesn't have to all be too serious. So where do we find these treasures? The go-to place where I always start is PubMed. So it's an online free search engine of the Medline database, has more than 30 million citations of biomedical literature. It's US-centric, but it's also global. And it's maintained by the US National Institutes of Health. It's a good go-to place to go. One tip I'm going to give you, so you almost always, unless it's a really old paper, you see the abstract. And then increasingly, more often, you're able to get access to the full paper. But some journals still want to make you pay for the papers. Fair enough. Well, one little thing that is not well known is that if there's a paper you really want to read and you don't want to pay $50 to read it or the $600 annual membership, you can contact one of the authors on the paper and ask them if they will share the paper with you. And they can. They can share it with you as an individual. It's a nice way to do outreach. Scientists love to hear that people are reading their research. And it's a nice way to make a connection. There are other ways I list at the bottom here, research networking sites. If you get on there, scientists will often share their papers there, so you can make connections there or download their papers. They make them accessible to the people in that community. So there's different ways to accessing the actual paper itself. But I don't want to leave out a real bounty of treasure that we have within our Feldenkrais community, which is through the International Feldenkrais Federation, is our Feldenkrais Research Journal. And again, this is a publication that's dedicated to research on Feldenkrais, but also discourse and opinion pieces and case studies on the Feldenkrais method. Wonderful for us and wonderful for the interested public. And then they also maintain this rich goldmine of a reference database. And this has been put together through a Zotero group library. So if you go, you can basically sign up, become a member, and then you get access to this huge database that's been largely spearheaded by the work of Cliff Smith, who you're going to hear, I think he's talking right after me in this session, and includes, beyond papers, curated collections that maybe even include PhD theses. So things that you're not normally going to find on PubMed, et cetera. So I just, again, wanted to show these as these are resources freely available to you, so you can easily find these papers. So now to just try and wrap up with the wealth, and I mean this, and I keep saying gold and wealth, and that's really interesting. maybe I'll bring good fortune to myself. I think it reflects my enthusiasm for the Feldenkrais method. And what's needed for health today. But there really is a wealth of opportunity for future Feldenkrais research, not only to build upon what's already been done, but in some new areas. I'm going to start with kind of thinking about basic research. Again, if you remember at the beginning, I said basic research is inspired by our curiosity about the natural world. How does it work? What is it? Well, let's think about the Feldenkrais method as a tool for research to understand what if we could rewrite the paradigm for how anatomy and physiology is taught in medical schools. That it's not the bits and parts and isolated, or systems working with systems, but wow, that movement on one part of the body, if that's limited, is going to impact movement on another part. We really have an opportunity, and the work through biotensegrity.
We have biotensegrity being covered here in this time around. So yes, we'll.
Yeah, I was excited to see that. That's laying the groundwork, and I think as we continue to engage people in maybe some more of the traditional fields in medicine, to really demonstrate using the Feldenkrais method that a new paradigm for how we learn and study anatomy physiology. And then, of course, we all talk about the neuroplasticity. Well, the Feldenkrais method and learning about neuroplasticity is a hot topic in biomedical research for a variety of reasons. And as I read a lot of papers or research in that area, I don't often hear Feldenkrais mentioned. I've even come across papers where musculoskeletal rehab researchers calling out for the need to develop rehab therapies that incorporate or are based on neuroplasticity. And of course, I'm waving my arms for Feldenkrais. The effectiveness research, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, because I think this is what we hear about and think about and use in our practices, and why people come to us. It's the rehab work, the neuromusculoskeletal rehab work, disorder treatment. But the two really hot areas I want to point out that we also kind of throw in there as, yeah, we do that too, but are huge growing areas where more money is being devoted to fund research, and the biomedical enterprise and clinical enterprise are asking for new solutions, is balance, healthy aging, because we have boomers that are aging and we want to feel really good for a long time, and then pain, chronic pain. Every single day, in my job, I'm encountering conversations, even amongst integrative medicine physicians, about how can we create non-pharmacological approaches for pain management, because we're dealing with a huge opioid addiction crisis. And they're looking at and have evidence for yoga therapy, Tai Chi, chiropractic, mindfulness, mindfulness-based stress reduction programs. Because some of these applications have engaged, I think it's because researchers are more familiar with the yoga that they do as a daily practice, or some of these other practices that they're more familiar with. And so there's been research on it. We have a lot to learn from how these studies have been done. We can do parallel studies or comparative studies with the Feldenkrais method. So again, it's a really ripe opportunity. And when I look at the research that's being published, and I value all of the modalities I've listed here, the uniqueness of the Feldenkrais method as a learning method, as a personal, exploratory method, is distinct. And I think we have a real unique opportunity to get on the list of the Veterans Administration recommendations, the NIH recommendations for non-pharmacological approaches to pain. Feldenkrais needs to be, have enough evidence to be listed up there with these other modalities where there's been more familiarity and more research. So that's kind of a personal flag for me. I think I'm almost at my last slide. This one here, I just don't want to skip, because I actually was talking to someone at the NIH, and all the research that I mentioned before, they consider particularly the pain issue is their biggest issue. It keeps them up at night. And I said, well, the Feldenkrais method has a great opportunity to solve the problems you're concerned about, such as chronic pain. And I found myself saying, but frankly, it's the low-hanging fruit. But it's true, because I think all of us that know, and I'm not trying to oversell the Feldenkrais method in any way, but this is from my personal experience, and as I'm being trained in the method, I see more and more it unfolds, that the Feldenkrais method is really about an understanding of self within the whole. And when I say self within the whole body, our communities, our humanity, the planet. So there are rich opportunities here, and practices and study designs that are developed that look at those questions, but they haven't looked at the Feldenkrais method doing this. The first, embodied cognition. So this is looking, interoception, proprioception, sense of, the interoception is, well, what am I feeling in my body? What are the internal senses? Well, that's our body scan right at the beginning. Do you know, this is that the NIH is holding a 2-day seminar on interoception and the research needs. Beautiful opportunity for us, where we always talk about in the Feldenkrais method how we have to be able to translate what we do to the scientific community. it's happening in kind of this natural way, where field researchers that are diving deeper into mindfulness research, they're looking at these theories of interoception, proprioception, kinesthetic awareness. And there's going to be funding opportunities. Again, Feldenkrais. The next one, I just want to give a little time to, because we see it every day, whether we realize it or not. And I mentioned this at the Feldenkrais conference, is examination of the root causes, or how engaging a sense of self, how the Feldenkrais method, allowing a sense of self-agency, empowerment, and choice, I believe can inform how we understand what we are seeing as an epidemic of what the CDC calls diseases of despair. This is uptick in violence, suicide, addictions. These happen when people lose a sense of hope, they feel they don't have choices, and they are externally focused rather than having a sense of internal self. And so I think there's a real important opportunity for the Feldenkrais method to be able to demonstrate, the importance of self, how it conveys a sense of self-agency and a sense of hope and a sense of choice in our society. It goes on and kind of gets bigger and bigger, all the way to human consciousness and creative expression and health. All of these are areas that they sound non-scientific, but I will tell you they are being published in studies on these topics are being published in some of our top health journals out there. So I think any of us that have experienced the Feldenkrais method can see the applications for these areas. So I want to add that as inspiration for Feldenkrais minded. I would kind of say my two slides break out, and this slide is kind of for the Feldenkrais minded scientific community, and the first slide is for the scientific community that doesn't know about Feldenkrais yet.
Yeah. Thank you, Diane. I want to pull. Who can pass up a quote by Jim Morrison?
So after all that science, right? We gotta really get grounded now, and think about Jim Morrison. From the Doors, musician, lead musician of the Doors. And I love this quote by him. He said, "Let's just say I was testing the bounds of reality. I was curious to see what would happen. That's all it was. Just curiosity." Well, research, just like the Feldenkrais method, is a process of inquiry to learn about ourselves and our world, all fueled by curiosity. So I just want to thank everyone for sticking with me through all of this nitty-gritty, and I just encourage everyone to stay curious.
Oh, thank you, Diane. If you can just stop sharing your screen there for me now.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. It was very, very helpful. In our byline, our theme of this year's summit is "The map is the territory," and of course research is trying to discover the maps that haven't yet been discovered, the maps that are inaccurate, and your passion to help put the Feldenkrais method on the map of research and clinical studies, and as a possibility for use, not that it necessarily is a clinical approach, but that it does it does have a significant therapeutic benefit. In just the same ways that you were talking about, just bringing hope to people, a self-agency, and giving them options for how to understand their own inner workings and what they can do with their lives. So thank you so much for being with us. I want to just mention that Diane, the PDF, the link to the PDF will be in the chat. Arlene's putting that over there for you. It will also be on the replay page. And also just to mention your website, and I know I have it, yes, groundedinscience.com, groundedinscience.com. That will also be in the chat. If at any point you get confused about all these people that you're hearing about in the summit, you just go to feldenkrais.summit.com. You click on any one of their names. It will take you to their speaker page, and you will find a link to their work there. And as we wrap up, I just want to say shortly after this, very shortly, I think, Dorothy will have an evening awareness through movement lesson for you that's very relaxing tomorrow morning at 6:30. Philly will have a video awareness through movement lesson that is maybe a little bit more active, but still very much along the lines of learning about yourself. And then at 8 o'clock, we will have the next talk in this research track. So we look forward to having you continue to join us here, Diane. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking on this incredibly huge topic in such a tiny little format. I know it was a challenge, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and for putting together this summit. It's a real treat.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, everybody. For us, we're signing off for the evening, or if it's morning for you, you're getting ready for the day. But for us, we're signing off for the evening. So we thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.